Harlem, New York. 2:17 p.m. Tuesday, September 12, 1967. The autumn air on 125th Street carried the scent of roasted peanuts, car exhaust, and something else, the metallic tang of fear that settles over a neighborhood when word travels fast. Frank Lucas sat behind the wheel of his powder blue Cadillac Eldorado, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might save his life. His custom-tailored Italian suit was damp with sweat despite the cool weather. In the passenger seat, a brown leather briefcase sat open, revealing nothing but empty slots where stacks of cash should have been. Exactly 43 minutes earlier, Frank had made the kind of mistake that separates the living from the dead in Harlem's Underworld. A simple miscommunication. A wrong address. A briefcase handed to the wrong courier on the wrong corner. $100,000 of Bumpy Johnson's money. Gone. Vanished into the maze of Brooklyn's Red Hook projects, with a man Frank had never seen before and would never see again. The mistake wasn't criminal negligence. It wasn't betrayal. It was worse. It was sloppy. In a business where precision meant survival, Frank Lucas had just proven he was human. Fallible. Weak. 2:03 p.m. The realization had hit him like a physical blow when he opened the briefcase at the designated drop point and found newspaper clippings instead of currency. His contact, a thin man in a gray coat who should have been waiting at the corner of Nostrand and Atlantic, had never appeared. Instead, Frank had approached a similar-looking figure 2 blocks away, made the exchange, and driven off without verification. By the time he discovered the switch, both the money and the stranger had dissolved into Brooklyn's afternoon crowd. Now, 14 minutes later, Frank sat outside Wells' restaurant, watching the entrance like a condemned man watching the gallows being built. Inside that restaurant, in the back booth he'd occupied every Tuesday for the past 8 years, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was having his usual lunch. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast cut diagonally, the same meal, the same time, the same precision that governed every aspect of his operation. Frank had rehearsed his explanation 17 times during the drive back to Harlem. Equipment malfunction, bad intelligence, unforeseen circumstances. Every excuse sounded more pathetic than the last. In Bumpy's world, there were no accidents. There were only consequences. What Frank didn't know as he sat in that Cadillac building courage for a conversation that might be his last was that Bumpy had already received 3 phone calls about the missing money. The first came from a police informant in Brooklyn. The second from a numbers runner who'd witnessed the botched exchange. The third from someone Frank had never heard of, a man whose only job was to watch Frank Lucas and report back. Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old that afternoon, his heart condition worsening. His time on Earth measured in months rather than years, but his mind remained sharp as a straight razor. When those calls came, he didn't shout, he didn't curse, he didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he did something that would confuse the police, terrify the competition, and teach Frank Lucas a lesson about power that was more devastating than any beating. He smiled. 2:19 p.m. Frank finally opened the car door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The briefcase felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every step toward the restaurant entrance was a step closer to judgment. What he expected was rage. What he expected was violence. What he expected was the kind of swift, brutal justice that had made Bumpy Johnson a legend in Harlem streets. What he got instead would surprise everyone, including Frank Lucas himself, because Bumpy Johnson understood something that Frank was about to learn the hard way. Losing money was a problem that could be solved. Losing respect was a death sentence that took years to execute. And the punishment Bumpy had designed for Frank's $100,000 mistake wasn't about recovery. It was about teaching every hustler in Harlem what happened when you confused opportunity with competence. In 72 hours, Frank Lucas would discover that the most expensive education in the world comes not from Harvard or Yale, but from disappointing a man who built an empire on the principle that mistakes have consequences, and consequences have a price that compounds daily like interest on a loan from the devil himself. The story of how Frank Lucas made a mistake that cost Bumpy $100 Kens is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to September 12, 1967. 1:34 p.m. Tuesday, September 12, 1967. Frank Lucas stood in the back office of Wells Restaurant, watching Bumpy Johnson count out $100,000 with the mechanical precision of a bank teller. Each stack was bound with rubber bands, each denomination verified twice. When Bumpy finished, he slid the brown leather briefcase across the desk without looking up. The instructions came in measured words. Brooklyn Run, corner of Nostrand and Atlantic. 1:45 p.m. sharp. Gray coat. Folded newspaper. Exchange briefcase for package. Verify contents. Return. Frank nodded once and grabbed the briefcase. This was his 27th courier run in 14 months. Routine. Mechanical. Beneath the talents of a man who considered himself Bumpy's most capable lieutenant, he walked out without asking questions, without repeating the address back, without acknowledging the verification protocols. This wasn't the mistake that would cost him everything, but it was the first domino in a chain reaction that would reshape his understanding of power. The drive to Brooklyn took 18 minutes. Frank's powder blue Cadillac cut through afternoon traffic, while his mind wandered to evening plans, new suits, and the woman in the Bronx who had been occupying his thoughts. He kept one hand on the briefcase at stoplights, but his attention was everywhere except the $100,000 sitting 18 inches away. Brooklyn's street signs had a way of blending into the urban landscape, faded and bent from years of neglect. Frank turned onto Nostrand Avenue, scanning for the intersection. His memory told him Atlantic, the slip of paper in his pocket, the one he hadn't bothered to check. Read Flatbush. 2 different corners. 2 different worlds. At 1:50 p.m., he pulled up to what he believed was the correct corner. A man in a charcoal gray coat stood against a storefront, newspaper folded under his arm, scanning the street with nervous energy. Frank didn't verify the cross street, didn't ask for the code word, didn't wait for the countersign. He simply walked up, made eye contact, and handed over the briefcase. The stranger, a mid-level grifter waiting for a bookie to pay off a gambling debt, felt the weight and didn't hesitate. The exchange took 11 seconds. No words were spoken. 1:51 p.m. exchange complete. 26 minutes until discovery. 2 blocks south, at the actual corner of Nostrand and Flatbush, the real Turkish courier checked his watch for the 10th time. Protocol was strict, 15-minute window. If the buyer didn't show, the deal was aborted. At 1:55 p.m., the courier made his decision. He walked away, taking the heroin shipment with him, and found the nearest payphone. He dropped a dime, dialed a memorized number, and spoke 4 words. The exchange never happened. Then he hung up and disappeared into Brooklyn's afternoon crowd. Frank drove back toward Harlem with his windows down, radio playing softly, calculating his cut and planning his ascension. The briefcase the stranger had given him sat beside him like a loyal companion. He felt powerful, untouchable, completely unaware that he was driving his own hearse. 2:03 p.m. A nagging doubt crept into Frank's gut. Just to be certain, he pulled over on a quiet side street near the Brooklyn Bridge. Standard protocol required immediate verification before reporting to Bumpy. Frank set the briefcase on his passenger seat and popped the latches. They sprang open with a metallic snap. Inside, where plastic-wrapped packages of pure Turkish heroin should have been, lay yesterday's New York Times, neatly folded and stacked to create weight and volume. Sports section. Classifieds. International news. Not a single grain of heroin. The world tilted. Frank's hands began to shake as he lifted each section, his vision narrowing, searching for something that would make this nightmare make sense. At precisely that moment, miles away in Harlem, the telephone rang in Bumpy Johnson's private booth at Wells' restaurant. He answered on the first ring, listened for 47 seconds without speaking, then said 2 words. "I understand." He hung up, opened his leather-bound notebook, and wrote a single line in careful, methodical handwriting. "Frank Lucas, education begins today." He closed the notebook, sipped his black coffee, and smiled the way a chess master smiles when an opponent makes the exact mistake that was anticipated 3 moves earlier. 2:15 p.m. 72 hours until Frank Lucas learns the difference between a mistake and a lesson. 2:19 p.m. Tuesday. September 12, 1967. The door to Wells' restaurant felt heavier than usual when Frank pushed it open, allowing a gust of autumn chill to cut through the heavy atmosphere of fried chicken, cigarette smoke, and cheap cologne. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork paused halfway to every mouth. The usual Tuesday afternoon crowd knew the rhythm of Bumpy Johnson's afternoons, and they knew Frank was walking out of step. He was supposed to return smiling, carrying quiet victory in his posture. Instead, he moved like a man walking toward his own execution, the empty briefcase hanging from his hand like an anchor dragging him toward the seabed. Frank didn't look left or right as he crossed the 30 feet of linoleum that separated the entrance from Bumpy's corner booth. He could feel every eye measuring distance, calculating odds, sensing opportunity in his obvious distress. At the back table that never belonged to anyone else, Bumpy sat finishing his scrambled eggs with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. Coffee cup positioned exactly 2 inches from his right hand. Toast cut diagonally, buttered to the edges. A folded newspaper forming a neat rectangle beside his plate. No sign of anger. No sign of welcome. Just the calm, measured expression of a man who already knew the ending to a story someone else was about to tell. Frank reached the table and stopped. For 3 full seconds, neither man spoke. Bumpy's eyes moved once, from Frank's face to his empty hands, then back again. That single glance was the first cut, precise and deliberate. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice carried no more emotion than a bank manager discussing interest rates. "Sit down, Frank. Tell me about Brooklyn." Frank slid into the booth, the vinyl cold through his expensive suit. His rehearsed explanation evaporated the moment he met Bumpy's gaze. Words came out in fragments, rough and uneven. Wrong corner. Gray coat. Thought it was right. Realized too late. The newspaper. The missing package. Each admission felt like pulling teeth from his own jaw, but he forced them out, hoping honesty might earn him mercy. Bumpy listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, his hands folded on the table like a judge hearing testimony. When Frank's confession ended, the old man asked 3 questions with surgical precision, each one designed to expose another layer of incompetence. "What time did you arrive?" "About 10 minutes early." "What cross street?" Frank hesitated. The lie formed, then died. "Atlantic." "But you said Flatbush. Did you verify the code word?" "I didn't ask for it." Bumpy nodded once. The interrogation was finished. Each answer had been a blade, delivered without malice but with devastating purpose. Frank realized with growing dread that there wasn't a single detail of his failure Bumpy didn't already know. This conversation wasn't about gathering facts. It was about exposing them, forcing Frank to confront the magnitude of his carelessness. Bumpy leaned back, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining basic arithmetic to a struggling student. "You think I sent you to Brooklyn to carry a briefcase, Frank? I thought it was routine." It was never routine. It was a test. Every time. You just passed the same test over and over until you got arrogant enough to fail it. Bumpy stirred his coffee once, even though he hadn't added anything to it. Money can be replaced, Frank. Trust cannot. Reputation cannot. Respect cannot. You lost $100,000 today, but that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is that you treated my money with less care than you'd treat your own shoelaces. Frank braced himself for the blow. A public dressing down. A demotion. A beating. Maybe worse. Instead, Bumpy reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the table between them, the sound of bundled cash hitting Formica like a judge's gavel. "What's that?" Frank asked, barely above a whisper. $150,000. Bumpy's tone remained flat, clinical. "What you lost, plus what it would have earned us in the next month. Take it. Consider it a loan." Frank stared at the envelope, his mind unable to process the contradiction. Relief flooded through him for approximately 4 seconds before the implications began to sink in. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, then paused. "I don't understand, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy studied him like a man evaluating a piece of broken machinery. "No. You don't. And that's the problem. You wanted responsibility. You wanted to handle real money like a businessman instead of a street soldier. Now I'm giving you that opportunity." The air in the booth felt heavier, charged with unspoken threat. Bumpy continued with the same calm tone, but Frank could sense the steel beneath the silk. "You have 72 hours, 3 days. You will take that 150 and turn it into 300,000. Clean, efficient, no excuses." Frank felt the relief drain out of him, replaced with something colder. 300, he repeated, his voice hollow. "If you do it, the 100 you lost in Brooklyn is forgotten. Wiped. You proved you can fix what you break." Bumpy's eyes locked onto Frank's with the intensity of a laser. "If you fail, the consequences will be educational for everyone watching. Not just you." Frank tried to speak, to ask questions, to understand the rules of this impossible test. Bumpy stood, adjusted his suit jacket, and placed one hand on Frank's shoulder. The gesture might have seemed fatherly to anyone watching from across the room. Up close, it felt like a promise of violence deferred. "You wanted to handle money like a businessman, Frank. Now prove you understand what business really means. Not gambling, not luck, not connections. Business, strategy, execution. Results. 2:34 p.m. Frank left Wells' restaurant with $150,000 and the growing certainty that he'd just been handed a death sentence wrapped in an opportunity. The same eyes that had tracked his entrance now followed his exit, but with a different calculation. They saw weakness. They saw vulnerability. They saw a man carrying more than money. He was carrying proof that even Bumpy Johnson's chosen lieutenants could fall. Behind him, Bumpy returned to his booth, picked up the telephone receiver mounted beside the table, and dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago. When the line connected, his instructions were brief, delivered in the same measured tone he'd used all afternoon. "It's time. Make sure everyone knows Frank Lucas is operating without my protection for the next 3 days." He hung up and returned to his coffee, knowing that by sunset, every connected man in New York would understand that Frank Lucas was alone in the wilderness, and the wolves were already circling. The education was about to begin. 8:06 a.m. Wednesday, September 13th, 1967. Frank Lucas woke with the kind of predatory clarity that comes from cornering prey or being cornered yourself. The envelope containing $150,000 sat on his dresser like a loaded weapon, untouched since Bumpy had handed it to him yesterday afternoon. He'd spent the night calculating angles, mapping connections, building strategies that looked flawless at 3 in the morning, but felt increasingly fragile as Harlem's dawn broke through his bedroom window. The mathematics were simple. He had the capital, he had the connections, and he had 72 hours to prove that Frank Lucas could operate as more than just Bumpy Johnson's errand boy. By 8:23 a.m., Frank had showered, shaved, and dressed in a fresh charcoal suit. His first move would be surgical in its efficiency: contact his regular heroin supplier in Washington Heights, purchase product at wholesale prices, distribute through his established network of runners, and double the money within 48 hours. Clean. Professional. Exactly the kind of business acumen Bumpy wanted to see. The first call went to Carlos, a Dominican middleman, who'd been moving product through Frank's territory for 18 months. Their relationship was built on mutual profit and reliable payment schedules. Carlos usually answered on the second ring, voice eager for business. Today, the phone rang 11 times before someone picked up. Carlos. It's Frank. I need to place an order. Significant volume. Cash up front. The pause lasted exactly 4 seconds too long. When Carlos finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of a man reading from a script someone else had written. Frank, my friend, I wish I could help you, but we're experiencing supply issues right now. Maybe next month. Next month? You told me last week you had enough inventory to supply half of Manhattan. Things change, Frank. You understand how it is. The line went dead before Frank could respond. He stared at the receiver, feeling the first cold finger of understanding trace down his spine. Supply issues. The oldest lie in the narcotics business, deployed only when the real reason couldn't be spoken aloud. Frank moved to his second option, the numbers runners on Lenox Avenue. Small but reliable operators who always needed product, always needed capital to cover heavy payouts. He dialed the first number, then the second, then the third. 3 conversations, 3 identical responses delivered with the same uncomfortable haste. We're fully stocked right now, Frank. Already got everything we need. Don't require any outside capital at the moment. Their words said no, but their voices said something far worse, fear wrapped in reluctance. They spoke too quickly, rushed off the line, sounded like men trying not to be caught talking to a plague carrier. By 9:47 a.m., Frank had made 12 calls. His protection contacts were mysteriously unavailable, their wives offering vague excuses about out-of-town business and family emergencies. His loan shark connections suddenly had no capital to lend. His gambling contacts claimed no games were running. Every door he'd walked through freely for the past 2 years had slammed shut in his face with mechanical precision. The realization didn't arrive as sudden revelation, but as slow, creeping certainty that filled his chest with concrete. Bumpy hadn't just given him money and a deadline. He'd systematically dismantled every advantage, every connection, every resource that had made Frank Lucas someone worth knowing in Harlem's Underworld. With a single phone call yesterday afternoon, Bumpy had transformed him from a rising lieutenant into a pariah, radioactive and untouchable. 11:47 a.m. Wednesday. 58 hours and 13 minutes remaining. Desperation forced Frank into territory he usually despised. Legitimate business channels, the kind of moves that separated professionals from street-corner amateurs. He visited loan sharks who operated outside Bumpy's traditional network, offering premium interest rates for short-term capital. Each one listened politely, examined his credentials with theatrical consideration, and declined with the same carefully neutral expression. At a pawn shop on 145th Street, Frank approached the counter, where the owner had once begged him for extensions on overdue debts. Today, the man leaned back in his chair, suddenly confident, examining Frank's expensive watch with the air of someone holding all the cards. "I can move some money for you, Frank," the man said, quoting a price 1/10 the watch's actual value. "But not the kind of money you're talking about. Not right now. You moved half this amount last month. Last month was different." The man's smile carried the satisfaction of a small predator finally getting his teeth into something larger. "Last month, everybody knew you belonged to Bumpy Johnson." By mid-afternoon, Frank considered the nuclear option, reaching out to Italian connections in Little Italy, families that operated parallel to Bumpy's empire while maintaining careful diplomatic distance. The idea died before it could fully form. Those families respected Bumpy Johnson the way smaller nations respected superpowers. They wouldn't risk that relationship for a lieutenant who'd fallen out of favor, especially not one carrying the stink of failure and desperation. Without Bumpy's blessing, Frank wouldn't be making a deal. He'd be signing his own death warrant. The isolation wasn't just professional. By evening, it had bled into his personal life with surgical precision. Frank returned to his apartment in the Bronx to find his girlfriend Francine waiting in the living room, wearing a new dress he hadn't bought her and makeup that was too fresh for this hour of the day. When she kissed him, her lips tasted like expensive cigarettes he didn't smoke. "Baby, we need to talk," she said, and Frank knew immediately what was coming. "Someone approached you. 3 someones, all of them with better prospects than a man who can't even get his phone calls returned." Her voice carried no malice, just the cold arithmetic of survival that governed relationships in their world. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Frank, but a girl's got to think about her future. Word is, you're swimming in deep water without a life vest." She left 20 minutes later, taking her clothes and whatever remained of Frank's illusions about loyalty. The disrespect was breathtaking. 48 hours ago, no man in Harlem would have dared look at her sideways. Now, the sharks were circling, sensing that the protection shield was down. Wednesday night settled over the Bronx like a burial shroud. Frank sat alone in his living room as darkness swallowed the city, the $150,000 spread across his coffee table in neat stacks. For the first time in his adult life, he understood the difference between currency and power. The money was useless paper without the infrastructure to move it. Bumpy owned the roads, the traffic lights, and the signals that made commerce possible. Frank was just a man with a fast car and nowhere to drive. Every connection he'd built, every relationship he'd cultivated, every advantage he'd assumed was his own, had been revealed as borrowed capital, extended on credit by Bumpy Johnson, and callable at any moment. The network he'd mistaken for personal power was nothing more than access to someone else's empire. Without Bumpy's name behind him, Frank Lucas was just another hustler with cash and no way to move it, drowning in shallow water while the shoreline watched with clinical interest. At exactly midnight, as Frank sat in darkness contemplating options that grew increasingly desperate, a soft scraping sound came from the hallway outside his door. He approached cautiously, hand instinctively moving to the gun tucked beneath his jacket, and found the corridor empty. No footsteps, no voices, just silence, and a single folded piece of paper lying face up on the floor. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unfamiliar but somehow expected. Day 1 complete. Your education continues tomorrow. A concerned observer. Frank crumpled the note, then smoothed it out again, reading it 3 more times. Someone was watching. Not just watching, documenting, evaluating, measuring his failures with the precision of a scientist recording laboratory data. This wasn't punishment. It was a controlled experiment, and Frank was the specimen pinned to the examination table, squirming under lights he couldn't see. He walked to his window and stared out at the Bronx streetlights, understanding with devastating clarity that the test had never been about making money. It was about teaching him what he really was, without the infrastructure that had made him believe he was something more. Bumpy Johnson wasn't trying to destroy Frank Lucas. He was trying to show him the truth, and the truth was more devastating than any beating could ever be. 54 hours and 7 minutes remaining. The education had only just begun. 7:23 a.m. Thursday, September 14th, 1967. The morning light filtering through Frank's apartment window carried the gray pallor of defeat, illuminating the untouched envelope of cash that had become his albatross. 36 hours remained, and the arithmetic of his situation had crystallized into brutal clarity. The wholesale markets were sealed. The connections were severed. The infrastructure that had made Frank Lucas someone worth knowing in Harlem had been systematically dismantled, leaving him with one option that tasted like acid in his throat: retail operations. Street-level hustling. The gutter. By 8:47 a.m., Frank stood on the corner of 116th and Lenox wearing a cheaper suit, having left the powder-blue Cadillac parked 6 blocks away. He couldn't afford to look like management while performing the work of a common dealer. In his jacket pocket, he carried $1,200 worth of low-grade heroin purchased from a Bronx supplier who'd smiled during the transaction, understanding exactly how far the mighty had fallen. 50 small bags at $30 each would net him $300 in profit. The mathematics were devastating in their simplicity. He would need to complete 500 identical transactions to reach his target. The impossibility wasn't accidental. It was surgical. The first sale happened at 9:31 a.m. to a skeletal junkie whose track marks told stories Frank didn't want to read. The man approached with the shuffling gait of someone who'd traded dignity for chemical relief years ago, eyes scanning the corner for familiar faces and finding instead a man in expensive shoes trying to blend into an economy that had no use for Italian leather. $30 changed hands in 47 seconds. The junkie disappeared into a tenement building. Frank pocketed the cash and felt something fundamental crack inside his chest, the sound audible only to him. Word traveled through Harlem's street network with the velocity of wildfire in drought conditions. By noon, every corner dealer, numbers runner and small-time hustler from 110th to 145th Street knew the same devastating truth. Frank Lucas was slinging individual bags like a desperate teenager saving for sneakers. The spectacle drew observers the way public executions drew crowds in medieval times. Former associates walked past with calculated slowness, making eye contact just long enough to register recognition and contempt before continuing their journeys. Women he'd bought expensive dinners for laughed behind manicured hands. Men who'd once requested permission to operate in adjacent territories now watched him with the predatory interest of sharks sensing blood in familiar waters. What Frank couldn't see, but began to feel with growing paranoia, was the invisible network tightening around him like a noose. In doorways and behind windows, through newspaper holes and over coffee cups, Bumpy's surveillance apparatus documented every humiliation with clinical precision. The old woman selling fruit on 125th Street lingered too long when he passed, her eyes tracking his movement with unnatural interest. The shoeshine boy stopped working mid-polish to watch Frank negotiate the sale of a stolen radio for $40. The barber paused his razor mid-shave when Frank appeared in the shop window, hawking watches to customers who knew they were buying desperation wrapped in gold plating. Each transaction was theater performed for an audience Frank couldn't identify, but knew was watching. Every sale, every desperate pitch, every moment of Frank Lucas reduced to the level he'd spent years escaping was being catalogued, measured, and reported back to Bumpy Johnson like laboratory data from a controlled experiment. The realization settled over him like heavy snow. This wasn't simply about failing or succeeding with money. This was a public demonstration, staged for maximum educational value, forcing him to crawl through the same streets where he'd once strutted with authority. 6:23 p.m. Thursday. 26 hours and 37 minutes remaining. The confrontation arrived with the inevitability of gravity, delivered by three teenagers who couldn't have been older than 19. They approached Frank's corner with the swagger of men who'd been given explicit permission to disrespect someone who used to command their fear. The tallest one, wearing a leather jacket 2 sizes too large for his frame, planted himself directly in Frank's personal space, violating the invisible boundary that separates negotiation from threat. "This corner's claimed, old man. You need to relocate your operation." Frank felt rage flood his nervous system like gasoline meeting flame. 48 hours ago, these children would have crossed streets to avoid breathing his air. Now they were issuing orders, their confidence built on information they shouldn't have possessed unless someone with real authority had granted them immunity. Frank's hand moved instinctively toward his waistband, fingers finding the familiar grip of his pistol, muscle memory from years of enforcing respect through the promise of violence. "You want to reconsider that statement?" Frank's voice dropped into the register he'd used countless times before, the tone that preceded emergency rooms and closed casket funerals. The young dealer didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, revealing gold caps on his front teeth that caught the streetlight like tiny mirrors. "Go ahead and pull it, Frank. See what happens next. We're operating under different protection now, different protection than you used to carry." The implication landed like a sledgehammer to the sternum. These street-level nobodies had been given explicit authorization to challenge him, which meant someone with genuine power had granted them immunity from retaliation. Frank's hand remained on his weapon, but his mind raced through calculations that all terminated in the same conclusion. Violence would only accelerate his destruction. If he shot these kids, he'd be declaring war on whoever was backing them, and in his current position, that conflict would last approximately as long as it took for retribution to find him. Frank released his grip on the gun and stepped backward, the retreat more devastating than any physical beating. The teenagers laughed, a sound that would echo in his nightmares for years to come. They didn't take his corner. They didn't need to. The point had been made with surgical precision. Frank Lucas no longer commanded respect through fear. He was just another aging hustler clinging to memories of power that had evaporated like morning mist. By Thursday evening, Frank sat in his apartment counting the day's earnings with hands that trembled from exhaustion and systematic humiliation. $3,140 in crumpled bills, sweat-stained and passed through too many desperate transactions. 2 complete days of grinding street-level sales, swallowing disrespect and performing degradation for an invisible audience, and he'd managed to earn barely 2% of what Bumpy demanded. The mathematics weren't just impossible. They were deliberately, cruelly impossible. The psychological breakdown arrived not as dramatic collapse, but as quiet revelation, settling over Frank like a burial shroud. Sitting alone in darkness, cheap scotch burning his throat, Frank finally understood the architecture of Bumpy's trap. There had never been a way to win. The 72-hour deadline. The $150,000 stake. The systematic isolation from every useful connection. It was all theater. A carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to teach Frank a single, devastating lesson. Everything he'd accomplished, every victory he'd celebrated, every moment of power he'd enjoyed had been borrowed capital, extended by Bumpy Johnson and revocable, without notice. Frank Lucas, without Bumpy's blessing, wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't even particularly competent. He was just another street hustler with delusions of adequacy, and the past 48 hours had been designed to strip away those delusions like layers of paint, exposing the raw, unremarkable wood underneath. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the telephone rang with the sharp insistence of a blade cutting through silk. Frank stared at it for 3 full rings before answering, knowing with absolute certainty who was calling and what the message would contain. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, professional, completely devoid of emotion or mercy. "Mr. Johnson would like to see you tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Bring whatever you've managed to earn." The line went dead before Frank could respond, leaving him holding a receiver that buzzed with dial tone and implied threat. 12 hours remained. 12 hours to face whatever final lesson Bumpy had designed, carrying $3,000 in pocket change as evidence of his comprehensive failure. Frank set the phone down with careful precision, understanding with devastating clarity that tomorrow wouldn't bring redemption or forgiveness. Tomorrow would bring the bill for his education, and the currency Bumpy Johnson accepted had nothing to do with money. The final 12 hours stretched ahead like a corridor leading to an execution chamber, and Frank Lucas had nowhere left to run. 11:47 a.m. Friday, September 15th, 1967. The abandoned textile warehouse squatted on the edge of the South Bronx like a monument to industrial death, its brick facade blackened by decades of soot and neglect. Frank Lucas sat in his powder-blue Cadillac for 13 minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the loading dock entrance through cracked safety glass. This wasn't Wells' restaurant. This wasn't familiar territory. This was neutral ground chosen for one specific purpose: final judgment. The warehouse interior stretched before him like a cathedral of failure, vast and hollow, stripped of the machinery that had once given it purpose. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight, piercing broken skylights, illuminating concrete floors, stained with oil and abandonment. The air carried the metallic taste of rust, the sweet decay of rotting wood, and something else, the particular silence that settles over places where hope has died. At the center of this industrial graveyard sat a single card table and 2 metal folding chairs, positioned with geometric precision beneath the brightest shaft of natural light. Behind the table, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit that seemed to mock the surrounding decay, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. On the table before him lay a manila envelope containing $150,000, positioned exactly 18 inches from the edge. Pristine and untouched, a silent testament to Frank's complete failure to move a single dollar of it. Frank approached with the mechanical gait of a condemned man walking his final 20 steps. Each footfall echoed off concrete walls, the sound bouncing back like accusations. In his jacket pocket, he carried a crumpled paper bag containing $3,140 in sweat-stained bills, the pathetic sum total of 72 hours of systematic humiliation, street corner hustling, and the complete dismantling of everything he'd believed about himself. He reached the table and stopped, placing the paper bag beside Bumpy's envelope with the shame of a failing student presenting homework to a disappointed teacher. The contrast was devastating. His crumpled bills looked like garbage beside the neat stack of currency that represented real power, real infrastructure, real competence. Bumpy didn't acknowledge the money immediately. He continued studying the grain of the card table as if reading a map only he could decipher. When he finally raised his eyes, they held neither anger nor disappointment, but something far more terrifying, the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining diseased tissue before excision. "Sit down, Frank." Frank lowered himself into the metal chair, the cold seeping through his expensive suit. For 30 seconds, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them like a blade, sharp with implications and unspoken verdicts. When Bumpy finally broke it, his voice carried the flat authority of a judge reading a sentence. "You think this was about money, Frank?" It wasn't a question, so Frank didn't answer. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. It was never about money. Money can be replaced. What can't be replaced is understanding. Respect. The knowledge of what you really are when you're stripped of borrowed power. Bumpy gestured at Frank's pathetic offering. This is what Frank Lucas earns in 3 days when he's operating on his own merit. $3,000. Less than a competent street dealer makes in a good week. The words landed like physical blows, each one calculated for maximum impact. Frank felt his jaw tighten, felt rage and shame competing for dominance in his chest. But he remained silent. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make this worse. "You confused geography with physics, Frank. You thought I was teaching you about markets and connections. I was teaching you about power and competence, about the difference between what you borrow and what you earn." Bumpy's voice dropped to a register that vibrated in Frank's chest. "For 3 days, you were just another hustler with cash he couldn't move. Why? Because you mistook access for ownership. The doors never opened for Frank Lucas. They opened for Bumpy Johnson's lieutenant. There is a difference. And that difference is the only thing that's kept you breathing in this city." Frank stared at the table, understanding with devastating clarity that every connection he'd cultivated, every relationship he'd built, every advantage he'd assumed was his own, had been borrowed capital, extended on credit by the man sitting across from him, and callable without notice. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. Do you?" Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, placing it on the table with the same precise deliberation he applied to everything. "Then you'll understand the terms of your continued employment. You're not fired, Frank. That would be merciful. You're being reconstructed, from the ground up. Starting tomorrow, you work as a street soldier. Collections. Deliveries. Enforcement, the work you thought you were too good for." Frank nodded, accepting the demotion. It was harsh, but survivable. He could rebuild. He could earn his way back up the ladder one rung at a time. "And there's one more component to your education," Bumpy continued, sliding the folded paper across the table. "Tonight, Small's Paradise, 8 o'clock. You will stand on that stage before the evening crowd. You will read this statement. Every word. Loud enough for everyone who matters in Harlem to hear." Frank unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, professional, devastatingly thorough. It detailed every failure of the past 3 days, acknowledged his incompetence in explicit terms, thanked Bumpy for his mercy, and requested permission to rebuild his reputation through humble service. It was a public execution performed with words instead of bullets, forcing Frank to serve as both victim and executioner. "You'll apologize to every person you dealt with during your 3 days of desperation," Bumpy explained with the same clinical tone. "Every dealer you tried to undercut, every connection you attempted to exploit, every individual who witnessed you scrambling in the gutter like a common street hustler. You'll do this because reputation in our business isn't built on what you say about yourself. It's built on what others say about you after you've proven you understand your place." Frank read and reread the confession, each word a nail in the coffin of his former reputation. The systematic restoration would take months, maybe years, rebuilding credibility one small transaction at a time while everyone who mattered watched and remembered the 3 days Frank Lucas had spent proving his fundamental inadequacy. "This will destroy whatever reputation I have left," Frank whispered. "Your reputation is already destroyed, Frank. This is how you start building a new one, based on truth instead of illusion. You want respect? Earn it by showing you can take punishment without breaking. Read the confession. Do the work. Climb back up the ladder one rung at a time, proving competence instead of assuming privilege. That's the only way you'll ever be ready to sit in this chair." Frank refolded the paper and placed it in his pocket, the weight of it feeling heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. He stood to leave, feeling smaller and more fragile than he had ever felt in his adult life, when Bumpy's voice cut through the warehouse air one final time. "Frank." He stopped and turned back. Bumpy was studying him with the expression of a master craftsman examining a piece of broken machinery, deciding whether it was worth the effort to repair. "The man who took your money in Brooklyn. The one in the gray coat, the wrong corner. The newspaper in the briefcase." Frank felt his blood turn to ice water. "What about him?" Bumpy's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. The final lesson preparing to land with surgical precision. "He works for me. Has for 6 years. Runs numbers out of Red Hook. I sent him to that corner at that exact time. Told him to take whatever briefcase was handed to him without asking questions." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow, stealing his breath, rewriting the entire narrative of the past 72 hours in a single sentence. The mistake hadn't been random. The theft hadn't been opportunistic. Bumpy had engineered the entire catastrophe from the beginning, creating a controlled disaster designed to expose Frank's weaknesses with scientific precision. "Your mistake wasn't losing the money, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice echoing in the empty warehouse. "There was never any money to lose. Your mistake was thinking you were ready to handle responsibility without supervision. You got sloppy because you got comfortable, and comfort in our world is just a slow way of committing suicide. I gave you enough rope to hang yourself, then watched you tie the knot." Bumpy stood, picked up the envelope containing $150,000, and walked past Frank toward the warehouse exit. He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh Bronx sunlight, and delivered his final instruction without turning around. "Small's Paradise. 8 o'clock tonight. Don't be late. And Frank? Bring humility. It's the only currency you have left that's worth anything." The old man disappeared into the afternoon light, leaving Frank standing alone in the abandoned warehouse, holding a written confession and understanding with devastating clarity that he'd never been taking a test. He'd been starring in a demonstration, performed for an audience of one, teaching a lesson that would define the rest of his criminal career. Power without competence is just borrowed time, and in Bumpy Johnson's world, only one man controlled the clock. The education of Frank Lucas was complete. Now, if he was smart enough to learn from it, the reconstruction could begin. 8:02 p.m. Friday, September 15th, 1967. Small's Paradise was packed beyond capacity, every table claimed by men who normally avoided public attention. The Friday night crowd hadn't come for music or drinks. They'd come for theater of the cruelest variety. A public execution performed without weapons, where the condemned man would serve as his own executioner. Bar owners, lieutenants, runners and women who'd once chased status by association filled every available space, drawn by word that had traveled through Harlem's underground network with the efficiency of a well-run numbers racket. Frank Lucas was going to stand on stage and bury his own reputation, one carefully scripted word at a time. The stage lights, which usually illuminated jazz legends and carefree opulence, now spotlighted a single microphone stand, and a man whose expensive Italian suit suddenly looked like a costume that no longer fit. Frank stepped into the circle of light carrying the folded paper that would serve as his professional obituary. The conversations died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete that his footsteps on the hardwood floor echoed like gunshots in a cathedral. He unfolded Bumpy's confession and began to read with mechanical precision. No tremor in his voice. No attempt at improvisation. Just cold, controlled articulation as he detailed 3 days of systematic failure. He acknowledged his incompetence in Brooklyn, confessed his arrogance in assuming he could operate without proper supervision, thanked Bumpy Johnson for the mercy of allowing him to continue breathing. Each sentence was a nail, each admission a hammer strike pounding his old reputation into the ground. When he finished, no applause followed. The crowd simply absorbed the lesson Bumpy had designed this spectacle to teach. Competence cannot be faked, respect cannot be assumed, and the distance between lieutenant and street soldier is measured in infrastructure, not rank. The months that followed were systematic reconstruction, brutal in their monotony and precise in their purpose. October meant collecting debts from small-time gamblers, work usually delegated to teenagers proving themselves worthy of real responsibility. November brought delivery runs across borough lines while senior operators handled actual negotiations. December found Frank standing on frozen corners in cheaper suits, watching territories for signs of encroachment, his powder blue Cadillac replaced with a delivery van that attracted no attention or envy. Each task was menial. Each assignment was beneath the capabilities of the man Frank had believed himself to be 6 months earlier. But he performed them with mechanical precision, never complaining, never requesting advancement, understanding that every small job completed correctly was a brick in the foundation of a reputation built on competence rather than connections. The other lieutenants watched his systematic humiliation and learned the lesson Bumpy had intended. Ambition without ability was suicide, executed slowly through accumulated failures rather than sudden violence. By March 1968, Frank had earned back a small territory on Harlem's eastern edge, 4 blocks of modest income that wouldn't attract competitors or generate envy. The money was adequate but unremarkable. The responsibility was real but limited. It was exactly what Frank Lucas had proven himself capable of handling. No more and no less. But something fundamental had shifted in his approach. The arrogance was gone, replaced by systematic thinking. The assumptions were gone, replaced by verification protocols. He learned that a missing crate wasn't just theft, but a breach in the distribution network that could rot the entire structure. He understood that respect wasn't about fear, but about reliability, built through consistent performance over time. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. Bumpy's education in humility had made him a better operator than success ever could have. He was more careful now, more strategic, more aware of the infrastructure that made organized crime possible rather than just the profits it generated. He saw the invisible scaffolding, the cops on quiet retainers, the runners who doubled as informants, the systematic networks of trust and reputation that separated professionals from amateurs. Through 1968, Bumpy Johnson's health deteriorated with visible acceleration. His heart condition, manageable for years through careful control, began to accelerate beyond medical intervention. He moved slower, spoke less, but his eye remained on Frank. The reports kept coming in, reliable, careful, disciplined. In July, Bumpy collapsed at Wells Restaurant during his regular Tuesday lunch and died 3 hours later at Harlem Hospital, leaving behind a power vacuum that threatened to consume everything he'd built. Frank Lucas stood at that crossroads, facing a choice that would define his criminal career: apply the lessons learned during 72 hours of systematic humiliation, or repeat the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him. When he finally made his move into the heroin trade, it wasn't through violence or intimidation, but through systematic innovation. The blue magic empire that would flood New York's streets was built on the foundation of systematic thinking Bumpy had forced him to develop, controlling supply chains like a numbers racket, managing lieutenants with the same discipline he'd been taught, never forgetting that access was not. Ownership and protection was not permanent. Every verification protocol Frank implemented could be traced back to that Brooklyn corner mistake. Every supply chain innovation reflected lessons learned during 3 days of watching doors slam shut because he'd confused access with ownership. Every strategic decision was filtered through understanding that competence cannot be faked and respect cannot be assumed. Frank Lucas learned that in the underworld there are no small mistakes, only expensive educations. The $100,000 Bumpy Johnson never recovered became the most valuable investment in Frank's criminal career. Because sometimes the most important lesson isn't about money. It's about the price of thinking you're smarter than the system that made you.